Greetings, everyone, to our first presentation of Phase 1 to the Town Zoning Regulation Rewrite. I'm Ben Philbrick, Chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission, and I'd like to give a very brief background as to how and why we are here today. The last rewrite was done in 1979, 44 years ago. We are overdue. Much has changed with their state statutes, amendments, and of course within our town itself. In 2016, there was a public information forum workshop, I think held by Jason Vincent, to get things rolling interesting-wise with people of Stonington. The planning department has been seeking funding for this project since at least 2018, if not earlier than that. The Board of Finance finally came through in the 2021-2022 funding with a 2-year rewrite. They did it in 2 phases of financing. And thereby that put in motion a search committee, request for bids, and an interview process. FHI Studios was selected, and we had our first meeting, at least with Francisco, about a year ago. I think a year ago, early August. He was probably working before that. And I'd also lastly like to thank the planning department, initially led by Keith Brines, along with Gail Phoenix, Candy Palmer, with assistance from Susan Cullen. And now we have our new planner, Clifton Eiler, here. Maybe you can wave, Clifton, as our new town planner. So that leads us to tonight's presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Francisco Gomes of FHI Studio. All yours. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you, Ben. And thanks for the introduction. I'm also joined by Nick Campbell, who's working behind the scenes to ensure that this meeting is conducted smoothly and all the technical aspects go on without a hitch. So thanks to Nick for that. Ben introduced me already, just to give you an idea of who I am and who FHI Studio, or what FHI Studio is. I'm a senior project manager with FHI Studio. I'm also a professional planner. I work with communities across Connecticut on comprehensive plans and zoning work, and have been in this line of work for a couple decades now. I've really enjoyed working in Stonington to date. There's clearly a need, and we're very happy to be here to help fill that need. FHI Studio is a Hartford-based firm, so we're a local planning firm with many staff members that live in the region, and we are a planning firm that specializes in working with Connecticut's municipalities. So with all that said, that's who we are, and now I'd like to get into our agenda for this evening. So first, I want to talk about the meeting format and how the technicalities of it will work. And hopefully everyone can both see and hear me clearly. And you've probably already noticed that you are muted. When we get to the Q&A portion of this meeting, we will enable you to be unmuted so you can ask questions, provide us comments. So I'll go over that in more detail in the next slide. Then we'll get into a little more detail as to the purpose of the zoning update. As Ben mentioned, the zoning was originally adopted several decades ago, and this update is long overdue. We will discuss the process that we have gone through to date in updating these zoning regulations. And we are in what we call phase 1, and I'll get into more detail as to what that involves. But I will go over the revisions that we've made to date as part of phase 1 in detail. And then I'll talk about what's involved in phase 2. So we'll look ahead to phase 2, and then we will open it up to questions and answers that you might have. All right. So first of all, the virtual meeting format. This is a Zoom webinar. I think most of you are probably familiar with Zoom by now. The webinar version of Zoom is a little different than the Zoom you might use on a daily basis, but same basic principles apply. All participants are automatically muted. When we get to the Q&A, if you would like to ask a question, you simply raise your hand. Click on the raise hand icon, which you can see on the bottom of the screen here. And then Nick will be able to unmute you, and we'll call upon you to ask question, provide comment, and open it up to discussion. If there's anything you would like to just type in as we go along, feel free to enter that into the Q&A. So use the Q&A icon and you can type in your question. If you have any technical difficulties, technical questions about getting something to work in the Zoom function, use the chat, and that will enable you to chat with Nick, and Nick will hopefully be able to help you resolve your issue. All right. It's really important that when we go Q&A, that we keep all questions and comments relative to this project, to the zoning work being conducted in this rewrite. And what we will not do this evening is talk about any specific projects. So this rewrite and this meeting this evening is not really intended to address any ongoing issues with specific properties or projects. If your concern is really related to a specific property, application, project, ask us a question about the larger issue that is surrounding that, and we will address that. Okay, so that's the basic format of our meeting. Next, the purpose of the update. As Ben noted, the regulations were originally adopted in 1961. And since then, they have been updated and revised on a piecemeal basis by multiple authors. That includes various town planners over the 5 decades or so since, going on 6 decades. Applicants who are, or lawyers who have submitted their zoning proposals that may have been adopted by the commission, revisions made by the commission itself. And as you might imagine, with multiple authors at work, there are inconsistencies across the language of the regulations, and formatting inconsistencies, language inconsistencies, terminology inconsistencies. And that gets to be a problem over time. So what we found in our review of the regulations, as I just mentioned, is inconsistent language and terminology used. Additionally, the regulations are not compliant with recent statutory changes. There has been a flurry of legislative activity surrounding zoning and land use over the past 2 or 3 years. And the zoning regulations in Stonington, like many other communities, have not kept up. And this is our opportunity to ensure that the zoning regulations are compliant with statute, and we've done exactly that. There are also case law implications with respect to land use and zoning in Connecticut and Supreme Court case law as well. And we want to ensure that we're following best practices as suggested by case law. It very often takes legislation a long time to catch up with the case law. So we are going beyond what statute enables in zoning by also looking at how that plays out in the courts. We found that the regulations as they stand contain multiple errors, inconsistencies, ambiguities, and various omissions. They are overly restrictive in some areas, so very high standards and requirements for specific districts or uses, and overly permissive in other areas. So not a lot of regulations for specific uses or certain districts. The existing regulations are excessively long for a small to medium-sized town at 348 pages. They lack illustrations or have illustrations that are lacking in detail and clarity. They have definitions that are incomplete. It's really important that all uses and terminology in the zoning regulations be defined so that they are not argued over. And we found that 46 of 98 permitted uses are not defined, which means it's can be subject to debate as to whether or not a use is allowed in town because it is not defined. The regulations have references that are dated. Some of the sources referenced no longer exist. References to older plans of conservation and development, as an example. They have subsections in illogical places or sequences. They have identical or redundant information and regulations repeated multiple times, which adds to the page count and provides an opportunity for inconsistency if changed in one spot, not the other. And in addition to that, the regulations have awkward and cumbersome wording in many sections, run-on sentences, passive language, overly complex phrasing, and that just make it very difficult to read, follow, and use. So these are some of the many issues that we are seeking to correct in this phase 1 update. Okay, next, I'd like to zoom out a little bit and talk about what zoning is and some of the basic elements of zoning. So zoning regulations are part of your municipal ordinance. They're one section of your municipal ordinance, and they are enforced by your zoning enforcement officer, administered by your planning and zoning department and planning and zoning commission. And the regulations are comprised of standards, and those are the individual items that comprise the regulations that tell you what is allowed, how much of it allowed, how big, where it's located, all the details of what is permitted or not permitted in the town of Stonington with respect to land use and development. So those are that's the line by line regulations that comprise the zoning regulation document. The other piece of this is where the standards are applied, and that's your zoning map. Those are individual zoning districts. So the regulations vary from district to district. The next part is how the standards are conveyed, and that's your zoning regulation document, how it's organized, formatted, structured, and so that's how it's conveyed. And how your regulations are conveyed are incredibly important in terms of for ease of administration, coherency, and for ease of use by a wide audience, including applicants, the general public, commissioners, staff, etc. And then finally, how are standards administered and enforced? So what are the procedures and policies by which those standards are administered and enforced? Much of that is codified within the zoning regulations document, and others are just standard policies and procedures that both the commission and the planning and zoning department have. Okay, so I'd like to now talk about when I say our perspective, I mean FHI Studio and really most of the professionals doing this work today on our perspective on regulations and what's important. So first of all, regulations, they should regulate land use and development as authorized and enabled by Connecticut general statutes. And it's chapter 124 of that statute that gives municipalities zoning authority. So it's really important that your regulations are consistent with the authority that's been granted to the town via that legislation. Next, your regulation should effectively reflect and support the community's visions and goals, and that can be expressed through many planning documents, such as the Plan of Conservation and Development, other planning documents, and what could be accepted as a general consensus on what your values are as a community. The regulation should be user-friendly for applicants, planning staff, and commissioners. They should be structured to allow for ongoing amendments. And this is the reality of regulations, as we know that within a year of a brand new set of regulations being completed and adopted, it's likely that they'll be opened up for some sort of change or amendment. And we need to ensure that they're organized and structured in a way that allows for that without disrupting the entire organization of the regulations. They should be consistent in the tools, format, and language used. So the approach to regulation and how that regulation is organized, presented, it really shouldn't vary wildly from one zoning district to another. They should keep redundancies to a minimum. Helps to keep the page and word count down, and minimizes chance of errors and inconsistencies. They should be resilient to legal challenges, and this is incredibly important. Anything can be challenged, but they should be resilient to those challenges. And they should be up to date and compliant with statute and recent statutory changes. Okay. I'd like to talk about our process and how it is that we've arrived at this meeting this evening and the updates that we'll be presenting to you. First of all, this update has been led by the Planning Department. The Planning and Zoning Commission has been our steering committee for the project. We've met with them monthly since July of last year to review progress, and those meetings have been open to the public, and all meeting recordings are available on the town's website. We are also taking a two-phased approach to the update. I mentioned those phases earlier. And we're currently nearing the end of phase one. And in phase one, we're addressing all those issues that I just discussed. We have substantially reorganized the regulations, have made multiple corrections, have updated them to be compliant with statute. But we also will undertake a second phase of this process, which is anticipated to start as early as this September. And I'll get into what's involved in that a little later on in the presentation. But that will involve much more work and the consideration of really potentially changing what's allowed in which districts, and we'll take a look at various items, and I'll discuss that in more detail. We're not there yet, and what we want to do is we want to take all of our phase one work, bring it to a public hearing for adoption, and adopt all of this work, because we've done very important work to date that will be immediately beneficial to the town, and then have some larger discussions surrounding what more we could do with changing the zoning regulations to meet the community's goals and desires. So our phase one process, and I'll go through this slide by slide, and we've covered multiple tasks and assignments as part of this phase one process. Right now, we're towards the end of that. We're at the point where we're moving forward to bringing this phase one work to adoption. And that'll be followed by a brief training session that we'll do for staff and commissioners as to how to navigate and use the revised regulations. So we began with a review of all the relevant plans, and documents and regulations to ensure that any work we're doing is consistent with the recommendations of those plans. And that includes your POCD, which was done in 2015, your coastal resilience plan, affordable housing plan, which is very recent, open space plan, your subdivision regulations, wetlands regs, aquifer protection regulations, and other various documents that we reviewed. So I'd like to impress upon everyone that we believe that the changes we've made to date and the changes that we will consider moving forward as part of phase two will be consistent with the recommendations of these various plans and consistent with the regulations established by these other regulatory documents. Next, and this was a very involved effort, we conducted a line-by-line review of all 348 pages of the regulations. And this is just a screenshot from one of those pages. And that involved literally line by reading each line, noting any issues, providing comment on that, and then bringing that back section by section to staff and the commission for discussion as to how to address those issues and how to proceed. And so that's a reason why we're here a year later from our beginning, is because that was several months worth of work. We also updated the use summary tables. Your existing regulations have use summary tables. And it's intended to be a very quick reference to determine which uses are allowed in which districts and by what permit requirement. This was also accomplished in the existing regulations with text as well. There were lists, and we identified multiple inconsistencies between what was listed in the text and the zoning tables. So we've since corrected that, and we've moved to a format where all of this regulation is accomplished through tables. We've removed the various lists of texts which consumed multiple pages. We also developed a few different formats for the commission to consider. That consisted of, the information organized on the page in some different ways, different types of texts, fonts, font sizes, nomenclature systems, that being the numbering system. And we arrived at something that I think is very legible, easy to read, easy on the eye, and very effective in its purpose, not overly complicated, very easy to navigate. And so that's the screenshot or sample before you right now. And this is also a sample of the document that is currently online. And if you have not, as of yet, had an opportunity to view or download the draft regulations, they are available on the town's website. If on the home page, if you go to the announcement of this meeting, and click on that, at the bottom of that page, there is a link to the zoning regulations document, and that's exactly what this is screenshot from. As I mentioned, we were very intentional about how this was organized and the legibility of it. And we feel this document will be very legible on screen, which is increasingly how people use these documents as a PDF or in an internet browser, and in printed form as well, which I prefer the printed form. As I mentioned, we also once we agreed upon the format, we had to take your existing regulations and migrate them into the new format. There's a lot of work there to ensure that nothing was lost in the translation. And in so doing, we also made some various revisions to ensure that the regs were compliant with recent public acts, such as Public Act 29, there were multiple implications for your zoning. One of them being that we had to remove the basis of character as a reason for denying an application. So we had a lot of work to do to ensure that we were still achieving the same aims without language being loaded with character, because there are concerns with character being used as a basis of discriminating against certain forms of housing or other types of projects. Another example is that Public Act 129 no longer permits minimum dwelling unit size. So we had to remove any reference to a minimum dwelling unit size. It's completely governed by building code now. And those are things that we did in the course of migrating the regulations into the new format. So the existing organization, compare it to the new organization of the regulations, as I mentioned, was 348 pages. It was comprised of 9 articles and an appendices. We consolidated that down to 7 articles and an appendices. And we cut about 150 pages. So we're down under 200 pages. And we did that really without cutting any regulation. There were just a few items that I'll go over that we eliminated because they were no longer relevant. But we accomplished this without throwing out entire sections of the zoning regulations. So Your regulations that were in place prior that spanned 348 pages are still there. They're just in a new, much more efficient and effective format. And so I'd like to call out some features of that format. First of all, we try to make it as easy to navigate as possible, and easy for you if you were just to flip to a page of the regulations to know where in the regulations you are. Because for anyone that's ever used zoning regulations for any purposes, you know there's quite a bit of flipping back and forth that has to be done to various sections. And that can be very challenging when you don't know where in the document you are. So we have headers that let you know exactly which section of the document you are, not only the section number, but the name of that section. We have a footer at the bottom that provides a reference tab that lets you know which article of the document that you're located in. So you can quickly go between the articles. The section headings are very clear and easy to spot on the page. The major sections are a large font. The subsection headings have a blue bar. And for your purposes, these numbers to the right of the title are a cross-reference to your existing regulations. And we're just keeping those for the draft form. and the final form, those will be removed. But for your ease of comparing the new regulations to the old ones, they're there for reference, and it'll help you find things back and forth. In addition to that, the text is all left justified and consistently justified. It's not moving all over the page from left to right with various margin sizes. The cross references that are in the regulations, if it says see section 2.3, those are all hyperlinked in the document. So if you have a PDF, you could just click on the number 2.3 and it'll jump to that page in the document. We think this, as I mentioned, we think it'll be a very effective document digitally and in print form as well. The regulations also have new illustrations. We reworked a lot of existing illustrations and introduced new illustrations. And these are primarily for spatial concepts that are difficult to communicate in writing or in a table, whether it be building and roof height, to parking configuration, to parking lot requirements, or multiple examples. And they are all consistent in format, which means they have the same basic look and feel. So it doesn't look like they were produced in totally different eras by different authors. In addition to the zoning regulations document, we have produced a record of amendments. And it's not yet online, but we're working to get it online tomorrow in the same place that the zoning regulations are located. And this is intended to be a bridge between the existing zoning regulations and the updated zoning regulations. So it is comprised of a section number cross-reference, and that's exactly this page that we're looking at right here. So it identifies the prior section number and name. In this case, prior is your existing regulations. And the new section and name and any notes surrounding that. In addition to that, we've documented any sections that have been eliminated. We've documented all the regulatory text amendments. So wherever we changed the regulations, where other than just moving some commas and minor rewording, wherever there was a substantive change to what was written in the regulations, we documented all of that, and that's provided. And as I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of work to be done in your definitions. So we provided new definitions, and we also revised a lot of the existing definitions. We documented all of those in this record of amendments as well. So if you want to compare the two regulations to figure out exactly what's changed, this will be an incredibly useful tool for you in that process. All right, now I'd like to go on to talk about the changes that have been made. And I've got several slides here. I'll try to get through them in a timely manner so we have plenty of time for Q&A. So I might have to move through it quickly, but we could come back to anything in the Q&A if you'd like. As I mentioned earlier, we have eliminated sections. However, these were all regulations and standards that were no longer used, never used, no longer effective, or really just complicated matters. And this is it. You're just one slide. You're looking at 4 items. So in section 5.1, by example, we had a statement about conflict between the use table, which I talked about earlier, and the uses that were listed in text in the list. And if was a conflict between the 2 of those, the list prevailed and you should ignore the table. Well, we got rid of that issue entirely because we got rid of the list of text. It's all in a table now. So we didn't need that section. We didn't need that language anymore. So we got rid of that. Residential youth growth management. You had a section that limited the amount of applications and development by a fairly complex formula surrounding population growth and units per year, et cetera, et cetera. It was never effectively used by the town. And it is not clear, based upon our review of the chapter 124, the enabling statutory language, that the town has an authority to regulate growth in this way. So because of that, because the fact it was never effectively implemented and very difficult to implement at that, we have eliminated that section. As I mentioned earlier, there are some issues surrounding minimum unit size. We did have some regulations, 7.9, about minimum unit size and calculation of floor area ratio. And this was really unnecessary language. You still have all the measures necessary to properly regulate floor area ratio without this fairly complex provision that was in 7.9. So we got rid of that. And then finally, on the administration enforcement end of things in section 8.2.5, there was some confusion as to what is required of a zoning permit and zoning compliance with performance standards. In short, your zoning regulations have a page or 2 of performance standards regarding noises, emissions, and other standards. And the way the language was worded, it would suggest that all applications for every type of permit that are subject to performance standards need to be referred to the Planning and Zoning Commission, even those that are normally administratively handled by the zoning enforcement officer or staff. And so that just was not the intention of the original regulation. So we got rid of that confusing language. So that's it. I mean, that's the only thing that was eliminated from the regulations. The only regulation that was eliminated, right? We eliminated a lot of redundant information, but we did so without eliminating regulation. Now I'd like to talk about text amendments, and I'll try to pick up the pace a little bit here. Starting with small scale craft operations, soap making was prohibited, generally prohibited throughout the town. And we thought it was fair to open that up and allow for small and at-home craft businesses. I know if you go to a farmer's market, there's always soap there made by someone. So we thought that was something pretty reasonable to do. In addition to that, the keeping of rabbits and pigs has apparently been something that has come up on more than one occasion. It had been prohibited, the keeping of pigs prohibited in any farm operation, as well as the keeping of rabbits. So we've removed that prohibition. You still have to meet all the requirements of a farm and acreage and everything. So we're not talking about introducing these things to any household. But we just took pigs and rabbits off the prohibited animals list for farms. We did, however, add language to ensure that the keeping, breeding, or raising of animals for fur or laboratory purposes is prohibited, which we believe was the original intention of much of this regulation. Next item is we provided more flexibility to allow for reconstruction that's compliant with FEMA standards. Essentially, being a coastal community, you're subject to big storms that can impact a lot of properties at once. And we just improved the language to make it clear that not every single application for restoration of a property impacted by a storm has to go through planning and zoning commission approval again. There's still a lot of guardrails around this, but we're just trying to ease the potential impact that might have on reconstruction associated with any major storm events. You have a use that's currently allowed. It's boarding and tourist homes as a permitted use is identified. Neither the staff or zoning commission is aware of any boarding or tourist homes that are permitted, and we really didn't have a definition of tourist homes, so we presumed it was kind of like a boarding home for tourists. So we just eliminated that because you have bed and breakfasts that are allowed and lots of other types of accommodation. So we eliminated that, and that was, interestingly enough, was allowed just in commercial and industrial zones. So I don't know how many homes you're going to have in those zones. Next item is just an update for auto service and sales establishments. There have been some recent statutory changes, so that requires ZEO to approve locations. So we updated that language. Dog daycare and training centers currently are require a standalone building, but you apparently have multiple businesses that are currently operating out of multi-tenant buildings. So we changed language to allow for that. Open space requirements for developments are very stringent, and basically all the open space that is required has to be provided in one block. It can't be in two distinct areas of the site. So we allowed for a little more flexibility to allow for preservation of the most valuable portions of the site, regardless of whether or not they're contiguous. Next up, there were limits on street-facing first floors in your residential mixed-use districts, and we wanted to ensure that those street-facing first floors in mixed-use buildings are preserved for retail and commercial uses. So we added some language to ensure that residential uses occur on upper floors or to the rear of a building and not street-facing, and that's to really to protect the intent of a mixed-use building, is that it has some sort of retail or service function that fronts the street. So that's an example of language that we amended for that purpose. On to principal uses, we changed the special permit requirement for restaurants. Right now, if you have a restaurant, if you just change the name of it, you have to go through the entire special permit process again. So we got rid of that provision, provided the intensity of the operation wasn't increased. Along the same lines, if you expanded your kitchen by square foot, you had to go through the entire special permit process again. So we got rid of that, providing it doesn't intensify the restaurant use. On to accessory uses. As I mentioned earlier, you can no longer have a minimum dwelling unit size for a dwelling. So we eliminated that for accessory dwelling units. We also eliminated the servant and guest accommodation as an accessory use, which isn't to say we don't allow them anymore. We're just recategorizing that as an accessory dwelling unit. Essentially, they are treated exactly the same in the regulations. You can't have both a servant and guest accommodation and an accessory dwelling unit. And so it became apparent to us that what we're really talking about are accessory dwelling units, regardless of whether or not it's a tenant, a servant, or a guest. And I think many of us came to agreement that servant is probably some outdated language that would be better off without. So we're treating that all the same, and it's still regulated the same and allowed the same. We're just really changing the name and consolidating the two. With respect to accessory dwelling units, your regulations, as I mentioned earlier, are over restrictive in some places, and this is one of the places. Very over restrictive, which means there have been very, very few applicants or applications for an accessory dwelling unit that have come to the town. Essentially, they were limited to 33% of the total floor area of the primary structure. And we increased that to 50%. And that's just basic logic applied to that number. By example, if you had a two-story house, 2,000 square feet, 1,000 square feet per story, you wanted to build out your basement as an accessory dwelling unit, presumably it's 1,000 square feet. Maybe you're not going to use all of that, but that would comprise 1/3 or 33%. And that could be pretty restrictive. So we thought pushing it up to 50% would provide a little more flexibility. So it's a repeating of what we had before. Next, and still on the subject of ADUs, is curb cuts. We clarified the curb cut allowance to allow for a curb cut from another street serving the ADU. If you have an ADU, it's a rare property of a house that has a through lot or corner property. It might make more sense to provide that curb cut for the ADU directly off of that side road or rear lot, so a rear road. So we allow for that. We increased the permitted size of minor accessory buildings. And so here we're talking about like sheds from 100 square feet to 200 square feet, which basically means that you don't have to come in for a zoning permit for these minor accessory buildings. You can build them as of right, and provided they're in compliance with setback standards, etc. And this aligns with the building permit requirement, which only kicks in at 200 square feet anyway. So it makes it more consistent with your building permit requirements. We've revised the required special use permit for parking lot additions. Right now, the threshold was pretty unclear as to when a special permit was required if you were expanding a parking lot. So we put some parameters around that at 20 spaces. We also adjusted how commercial vehicle parking is regulated. Those are regulated by payload, which is very difficult to determine, much easier to determine gross vehicle weight, which is printed on the registration. So minor change. We also limit parking of recreational vehicles on a residential property to no more than one vehicle. Right now, there's no limit. So you could have your RV and boat and tow behind camper and anything else you could conceive of. There's simply not a limit. So we put a limit on that. So that takes care of our uses. Now I'll get into some of our other items, including the HI 60 zone performance standards, site design, and modification of parking regulations. In the HI 60, we removed some very vague language that very difficult to enforce and interpret. So we just cleaned up the regs by removing that and making the language more direct. With respect to performance standards, you do have noise as one of your performance standards. As I mentioned earlier, these include things like emissions as well, and particulates, anything that might be released by a land use or a building. Your noise standards in your zoning regulations are not to be confused with a municipal zoning ordinance that allows the police to enforce loud noise and parties and music, that sort of thing. So we made sure that the language is very clear as to what this is and is not. And we referenced the applicable state and EPA standards and limits, just to be exactly clear as to how they are to be used. On the site design front, your existing regulation is restrictive of ramps located in front yards, and I think we're all familiar with ramps that have been installed for someone, for a senior or someone else with mobility impairments, that in order to get into their home, they need a ramp. And that very often occurs in the front yard where there's space and where the door is the widest. Your regs currently restrict that structure from being located in the front yard setback, so we loosened that up to allow for that accommodation. We also put some controls on small mechanical equipment like air conditioner condenser units and generators to ensure that they are properly located on a site and screened. And then on the parking front, we placed some limits on the amount of parking that could be added, and some of the requirements for modifying a parking lot. There just was a lack of some controls on that. And we're getting close to the end, so please stay with me another 5 or 10 minutes and we'll open up to Q&A. More on parking lots. Your parking lot standards, we improved those standards and updated them to ensure that your standards for the size of the parking space, the parking aisles, how they're dimensioned, oriented, et cetera, are consistent with best practices. We did find some need for improvement, so we did update those. And really the goal is to really minimize the amount of impervious surface that has to be constructed to adequately serve parking. And that was our goal. So we're balancing between ensuring that people can move in and out of parking lots and parking spaces with ease and do so safely without overbuilding these things, and adding costs and adversely impacting the environment. We also added an electric vehicle charging requirement, and this was to comply with Connecticut's most recently adopted Clean Air Act, which basically is going to require that developers provide charging equipment. So we put that into the zoning regulations. Off-street loading berths. These are loading docks. Your regulations are incredibly excessive in this area, requiring some developments, not very large mixed-use developments, for example, residential developments, to provide multiple loading docks for tractor trailer trucks. So we reduced that. We still require loading docks. We just reduced the number of them and some of the thresholds to really be more practical. And in reality, because of the fact that these were excessive, the commission had to, on a regular basis, waive some of these standards, which is not an ideal practice. With respect to zoning permits, we did add some language to ensure that projects are constructed in accordance with the approved permit. So we put some checks and balances in place to ensure that when a building foundation is poured before the rest of the construction commences, that foundation is exactly where it's supposed to be in accordance with the site plan that was approved. And we provide some tools to the town to basically stop and put that, bring that construction to a stop if it's not consistent, in order to rectify the issue. On the bond front, we just did a bunch of stuff to ensure that the language is consistent with what's required by and enabled by statute. So not anything too exciting to talk about there, and no big changes. So that, in a nutshell, are the changes that we've made that go beyond what page something is on and the section number and how something might be organized on the page. Our review process that we're currently in, and we're looking to those attending this evening and the rest of the public to contribute to, has involved distributing these zoning regulations to the ZBA and Architectural Design Review Board, to which we have not received any comments or requests for changes. So we basically, regulations have been consistent with their expectations. We also intend to share with some other boards and commissions, including the Climate Change Task Force, Stormwater Committee, and really anyone else who's interested in reviewing them. We have shared these as required with Connecticut Deep as a coastal community. We need to provide it to them for your coastal review. That being said, we have not made any changes to any regulations with respect to your coastal zone. We anticipate addressing some of those issues in your next phase, and we've communicated that to Connecticut Deep. They've provided us some very minor comment that we have since responded to. We will also distribute these regulations to your local council of governments, SCCOG, and we are required to do so at least 30 days before bringing them to a public hearing for adoption. And they will review for consistency with any regional plans for statutory consistency, and they will distribute to neighboring municipalities to ensure that your neighbors don't have any concerns about changes that have been made to the zoning regulations. So around the same time that we send this to COG requesting their review, we will also officially file the zoning regulations with the town clerk. And as I mentioned, that'll happen at least 30 days before any public hearing for adoption. So now our very next steps, excuse me, in this process include an in-person public meeting, that we will hold August 17th. And that will occur at the Board of Education building at 7 p.m. And that will basically have the same format as this meeting. And I will provide the exact same presentation except in person. So you are more than welcome to attend that meeting as well. And if you know of people that were interested in attending our meeting tonight, but could not, please encourage them to attend that meeting, which is about 3 weeks from now. We are also holding September 19th as a potential public hearing date. Now that assumes that the feedback we received from this meeting tonight on our August 17th meeting, we're able to respond to that with any revisions needed to the zoning regulations in a timely manner to post the zoning regulations with the 30 days leading up to that September 19th meeting. And we hope that we can hold that schedule. Looking ahead to phase 2, as I mentioned, we are looking at transition as we near the end of phase 1, hopefully adopt these phase 1 changes. We are going to start up with our phase 2. And in phase 2, we were going to open up the regulations again, not the organization or the format, but what is allowed by the regulations. We'll take a look at allowed uses and permit requirements, your bulk area and height regulations. We'll review your residential zones, exactly what uses are allowed in those zones, density, et cetera. We'll take a look at your parking regulations, your sign regulations. We know that there's work to do there. Sign regulations should be content neutral, which basically means that they only regulate the size, construction, location, quantity of signs, and they are not regulating signs by type or by messaging. We'll take a look at your commercial and industrial zones. Excuse me. And we'll take a look at your zoning map. And I'm trying to get through this so I can get a glass of water and move on to the Q&A. And I'm almost there, so bear with me. And most importantly, as part of phase 2, we're going to do quite a bit of community engagement, which will include an online survey and multiple focus group workshops to invite you into the process, earlier into the process, and so that the community as a whole can participate in this next phase of the updates. So that being said, I'd like to open it up to any questions and comments, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And if you could all just give me, let's take a 2-minute break so that my glass is empty. I just want to get a glass of water. Let's put things on hold for 2 minutes, and I promise you I will be right back. Okay, I am back, and thank you for your patience. I see we have some Q&A. We have some hands raised. Let me first take a couple of questions. Let's start with some of the questions that are in the Q&A, and then we'll open up to people to unmute themselves and go ahead and ask questions. The first question from Ann Watkins. Please go over again the changes to mixed-use residential. Okay, so let me sum this up. The mixed-use regulations right now don't specify exactly where the residential is permitted and not permitted within the building, which means that the first floor street-facing part of the building, the residential development is permitted on that, not restricted. The intent of a mixed-use building is to allow for retail, service, restaurants, offices, mixture of uses. And the most valuable space for those uses is that first floor street-facing face. So we've added some language to reserve that part of a mixed-use building for commercial use, allowing the residential component anywhere else in the building, upper floors, first floor, but to the rear, the back side of the building, or a side street, whatever it may be. So I hope that answers that question. We have a question from Elizabeth. Did the presentation cover anything about properties that are unkept? Okay, properties that are unkept, that is a blight issue, and blight issues have to be enforced through a separate municipal ordinance outside of your zoning regulations. It has to be a blight ordinance. They can still be enforced by the zoning enforcement officer if that's the designated agent, but they are not, that is not addressed by the zoning regulations. It has to be through a municipal blight ordinance. So that unfortunately is outside of our purview because we are only working on the zoning regulations part of your municipal ordinance. Okay, I want to move on to some other folks that have asked questions, and I'll circle back. And I see so we're all over the place here. We also have some questions in the chat, but that's okay. I'll work. I just want to see if we have any content related questions in our chat. In your process, were various Stonington committees, boards consulted to gain their learning specific? And yes, and I think it may have been something that I answered following your questions. We did, as I mentioned, Design Review Board, Zoning Board of Appeals, and we're also going to consult with the stormwater committee and other boards and committees. So absolutely, the answer to that question is yes. Another question. So the September 19 adoption is not the final approval. It is the final approval for the regulations to date. So we have two phases here, and we will presume, or we're basically, our plan is to adopt all of the changes we've made in phase one to date and adopt those as the town zoning regulations to put that document into effectiveness. And then in the phase two process, we don't yet know what kind of changes are going to come out of the phase two process. But the idea being that process is going to take about a year. We will move through that process over the course of the year, and somewhere towards the end of that process, the changes that come out, the amendments that come out of that process, we will bring those back to a separate public hearing for adoption roughly a year or so from now. So it's a two-phase process, and I hope that answers the question. All right. See, and that, I think that's all the content related questions that found their way into the chat. Another question, the Q&A, does the first phase go to a referendum? No, it does not go to a referendum. It goes to a public hearing. So it's not a town-wide vote. It is a public hearing by which the Planning and Zoning Commission would vote to adopt. And it is a public hearing, which means, of course, that the town as you as a member of the public and as a resident have right to attend the hearing and testify. So that's exactly how that would be handled. All right, those are all the submitted questions. And do we have any raised hands for anyone who would like to unmute themselves and ask a question or provide any comments to us? If so, Nick, can you go ahead for anyone that's raised their hand to be unmuted?
Francisco, I'll go ahead and unmute Maggie.
Okay, thank you.
Hi,
Maggie.
Francisco. Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
We can. Yes, thank you.
Great. So I'm Maggie Favretti. I'm co-founder of the Alliance for the Mystic River Watershed. To be very brief, our primary concern is to bring together all of the communities, 4 towns and 2 tribal nations around the Mystic River Watershed to protect water from people and people from water. So we're looking at this zoning update as a tremendous opportunity to contribute to risk reduction for both slow and sudden threats in the watershed. So we're looking at beginning next week, creating an integrated and comprehensive watershed plan and looking for opportunities to integrate this with it. So my question is, as part of the focus groups, I don't know how many focus groups we're going to have, but are they going to be limited to residents of Stonington, or will we have some conversations that are really watershed wide?
No, they won't be limited. We haven't determined what the format of those workshops will be, but it's exactly our intention to use those workshops to address issues and topics. So environmental topics such as the watershed will be critical to that, coastal zone issues as well. So yes, I would say that there will be an opportunity for you and your organization to participate in and be represented at a workshop. And depending on the timing of the watershed plan, it could be very informative to our phase 2 work as well.
Yeah, I have one quick follow-up question, and that is, has FHI Studio, or perhaps you yourself, done much research into best practices with regard to climate risk reduction and perhaps using zoning regulations as a way of encouraging environmentally wise behavior?
We have a good part of the work we do is our plans of conservation and development for communities. And that is always a significant or a substantial subject area for those plans. And we have environmental planning staff that specialize in them. So to answer your
Great.
question, is yes.
Thank you. Love to talk with you further.
Absolutely. Okay, any other raised hands?
Yep, I'm gonna unmute David Rathbun now. David, if you're with us, you are unmuted, or you have the ability to unmute.
Hi, David. David, I'm not sure if you're speaking, but unfortunately, we're not hearing you. You are unmuted. You were unmuted. I don't know if there's a microphone issue. If you could try your microphone setting. Worst case scenario, if we can't get you unmuted, maybe you could type your question into the Q&A or your comment into the Q&A, and I'll try to address it that way. All right, Nick, looks like David's had some technical issues. Can we move on to the next person? Hopefully we could reconnect with Dave or have them enter his question into the Q&A.
Sure thing. Ann Watkins is now unmuted.
Yes, can you hear
Hi,
me?
Ann.
Hi.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that your response to my question about the mixed use was mainly in commercial areas where you have commercial buildings and potential areas for people who own those businesses to live in the building. What I was actually asking about was within residential areas that allow business out of your home.
Okay, so that's not mixed use as we define it in zoning regulations. That would be an accessory use to the home.
An accessory. Okay.
Yeah, that's like a home-based business, a home-based occupation. Those are considered accessory uses for a home, and those are permitted.
Yeah.
We have basically we are continuing the existing regulations surrounding those, which means they continue to be permitted.
Okay.
I think we've done a better job organizing those regulations and making it clear as to exactly what is permitted and what is required of someone with respect to any permits and parking spaces, et cetera. But those continue to be permitted. We haven't really opened that up substantially, and we have not reduced what's allowed either.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks for that. Yep.
Sure. Okay, is there anyone else with a raised hand?
Walter Johnson.
Hi, it's Walter Johnson. My
Walter.
question, I also want to question the mixed use. And the reason is you've got office space being severely reduced with work at home. You've got pressure on retail because of online shopping. And you've got plenty of shops and offices in various places empty. Why on earth would you do that?
Okay, is that, I just want to make sure you're done with the question before I try to
Yeah, I mean,
respond.
it just doesn't make any sense to restrict building owners when you've got trends where there's a shortage of housing in this area and the other two areas are secularly declining. Does that make sense?
We understand that concern, and you know the language that we added is very limited in its impact. we are simply reserving a small area of the building that is allowed by virtue of the fact that it is a mixed use. I mean, that's the intention of the regulation. Now, this doesn't prohibit residential buildings that are otherwise permitted. These are buildings and uses that were permitted. They were allowed to be built or developed because they were mixed use. This simply reserves the part of the building that's most valuable to the local economy, to the commercial district in which it's located.
Francisco, I
Reserves
respectfully disagree with you. Most of the buildings in like Stonington Borough, as an example, pre-existed zoning. And they were classified as mixed use because there were some offices and that had nothing to do with the zoning regulation. And what you're doing is now restricting building owners of those sites.
So first, let me respond to that by saying that a pre-existing use is grandfathered into the regulations and is allowed to continue that use. And these are for new applications, new developments, and redevelopments that are permitted under the mixed use zoning regulation, that are permitted as a mixed use. Not, there are other opportunities depending on the district that allow for residential buildings, entirely residential buildings, to be developed. We're talking about a very small part of your town and a very select districts, which are intended to be mixed use commercial village zones that have businesses, services that make them the places they are. And so we're talking about ensuring that the streets in those areas continue to support commercial development. And it's, I don't believe that the regulations will have, or they're certainly not intended to have, the type of impact that you're fearing.
Well, thank you very much for that. I would suggest though, since we are talking about a change in zoning that affects every property owner in the town, representing billions of dollars of property value,
That's not
the town give the opportunity to the citizens to be able to vote on this phase one.
So if I correct something right there, the changes in this set of regulations do not affect every property owner in the town. All right. That's simply not true. And it does not impact billions of dollars worth of property. There is billions of dollars worth of property in the town, but it is not impactful to all those properties. I walked through every substantive change that was made. The item that you're concerned about is really applicable to a very small number of buildings.
Yeah, I own about 5 of them.
Okay, all right. I can promise you, because you're concerned, and that's why we're here this evening, that we will take a look at this issue with the commission to ensure that we got it right. We're not adversely impacting property owners such as yourself. It's certainly not our intention to do so. But it's also our intention to ensure that the town's commercial districts, village districts remain viable and have commercial streets that don't completely go quiet. So that's the balance we're trying to achieve. I'm noting your concern. We'll bring it back to the commission, and we will, if we feel that we need to make any corrections to what's been proposed, we will do so.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Francisco, I wanted to add,
Yes.
there's a comment made by Walter regarding the borough, and these regulations won't affect the zoning regulations within the Stonington borough. They have a completely separate set of regulations, and I just wanted to clarify that for everyone.
That is absolutely correct. Thank you. Okay, are there any other hands raised, Nick? Anyone else we could call upon?
David Rathbun is still the only one with his hand raised. David, if you were able to resolve your
Dave, let's
microphone.
try you one more time. If you could try unmuting yourself and go ahead and try to ask your question. I'd love to be able to answer your question. So let's try one more time. And if that doesn't work, if you could try typing your question into the Q&A, that would be good. And if all of that fails, David, I encourage you to come out to the in-person meeting that we're holding on the 17th. All right, we have two more raised hands.
Yeah, Maggie raised her hand again.
Hi, I don't know what David was planning on asking, so I do hope he comes to the in-person meeting. But I just wanted to point out that he's the chair of the new Flood Erosion and Climate Resilience Commission.
Okay.
And so, of course, they should be on your list of local commissions that you're having take a look at the draft as well.
Okay, very good. And that's one of the boards and commissions that we intended to invite to comment on the zoning regulations. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Francisco, nothing
Yep.
else.
Okay, I'm just going to review the Q&A again, just to make sure we haven't left anyone out. Okay, and some just questions about the document, the draft document hyperlinks. That is a draft document. We'll ensure the final document, all the hyperlinks are operative, including the table of contents. So rest assured that the final document, all the clicks will work fine. All right. I think that satisfies all the questions and comments. So this is really the beginning of this process, not the end. And we are here to hear your concerns. And so, by example, the concerns surrounding mixed-use buildings and the language that was added, we'll take a very close look at that and seriously consider that to make sure it's not adversely impacting property owners. If you have similar concerns, feel free to rejoin us at the in-person meeting to voice those once you've had a chance to digest some more of this. And as I mentioned, the draft regulations are online. We'll get that record of amendments online too. It'll help you compare the two, and it shows all of the changes that were made that I went through slide by slide. It includes that within the record of amendments. I think that'll be easier for you in figuring out what has changed and how it has changed and the purpose, the reason it was changed. And over the next couple of weeks or month, I hope that you'll be able to provide us additional feedback. If you do have additional comments, questions, statements that you would like to make concerning this process or the draft regulations, please direct those to Clifton Eiler, your new town planner. He will be happy to receive those, and he will send those over my way. Alternatively, if you happen to know your chairman of the Planning and Zoning Commission, Ben, feel free to send them to Ben, and Clifton and Ben will work to consolidate those, get them over to myself and my team. We will work through those at our next meeting with the commission to ensure that our final draft that we're bringing to public hearing that responds to those concerns in some capacity. So with that being said, I'd like to hand it back over to Ben to officially close our meeting.
Thank you, Francisco, and thank you all, the public, for joining us. I hope we've answered all your questions. One thing I will reiterate from Francisco is the hyperlinks are not active right now, correct? Francisco, with the draft, but they will be absolutely active.
Correct.
in final
Yes.
version.
Correct.
There's no need to do it in the draft since they won't lead you anywhere till we adopt them. So that's a technicality, but
Yes.
we thought
Thank you.
Hyperlink would be a good addition down the road, and it will be maintained, I believe, annually going forward to keep things current. So without any other hand raising, thank you so much, Francisco, and look forward to seeing you in person next month.
Very much, and thank you to everyone for spending a summer evening with us to work through zoning. It's very beneficial to our process to have this input. So thank you, everyone.
Good night, everybody.